Does that do it? Ah, that does a thing. All right. Yeah, I'm Edward Blanch. I actually had a background in architecture is where I started. I did a undergraduate in a Bachelor of Architectural Studies, and then I did a Master's of Architecture afterwards, focusing mainly on digital design techniques before I moved into video games. So I actually come from quite a different background. I've been in the games industry for a number of years now, and I've come to a very specific sort of working model. So I'm going to talk about the things that I necessarily need to, that I kind of tend to think are important, but that doesn't mean that obviously these are the only ways that you can go about it. I work as a contractor as well as running my own game studio, as well as working as a part-time technical artist for Tin Man Games, whose shirt that I'm wearing here. And I work as a technical artist, basically looks after a lot of the technical aspects of art, as well as being required to do actual art as well at the same time. And I tend to have to work under pretty tight deadlines on quite a large number of projects. So this year alone, I've released 3 games across a variety of different mediums, both mobile, PC, and have worked on and contracted on games that run on console and what have you. So a lot of this type of stuff tends to come from kind of my experiences of having to work under quite harsh deadlines and being able to get things done. So one of the most pertinent things that I talk about is game art is a process. It's really games literally aren't ever done. You just stop working on them eventually. And in this particular one, art is no different from that. You can theoretically work on anything forever, and you have to try and start to think about art as being part of an ongoing process, both from what you think about its creation to exactly how you're going to think about creating it. If you don't mind, I'm just going to quickly start timing this, because otherwise I'm going to run well over. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, and that's always one of the things that's really interesting, is people tend to try and imagine their art or artwork as being something that's done. Here is it looking beautiful and pristine and finished, and this is what it will look like. Where in reality, that's kind of where it starts, and then you just keep iterating on things until they're done. So one of the biggest areas, and part of the reason why I'm so into technical art these days, is I like to think a lot about process as well as pre-production as becoming a really important part about the art process, as in that it takes place and is involved with the processes of design and story, because they all end up impacting each other. So what I like to talk about is the concept of the tone of what you're working on tends to always come down to being one of my most important underlying components of the way in which I've ended up thinking about art and trying to relate and interrelate things back, which is, what is the tone that you're trying to convey with the thing that you're trying to create? So in this particular one, I wish I had a photo of it, because I wish. Has anyone here played Don't Starve by Cly? Okay, well, there's a few people. It's a game that I really credit as being able to have such a perfect, consistent tone, which is that everything down from the color to the line work to the audio design, everything complements each other and works together to help bring that together. And this is what I really start to think about when you start to go into design. So before you even start putting images to paper, one of the really important things to start thinking about is you start thinking about what the art that you're creating is trying to convey, because this will end up becoming a really important part about where you decide to spend time and where you decide to spend decisions. Usually you have to do a lot of work, and you have to really, really tightly prioritize where you're putting your time into your artistic endeavors. All games are essentially symbols for something. They're obviously not real. If you have a chair in a video game, it's the symbol of a chair, and the characters will use that chair in whatever way that the designer determines. So really what that chair has to show the player is the sense of chairness. What about it sells the concept of being a chair? And this sounds like kind of really obvious stuff until, does that mean you're going to spend 20 hours carefully sculpting the perfect chair that's going to sit in the corner and nobody's going to pay attention to it? All of a sudden, you can end up finding yourself in very scary time sinks when you have 150 chairs that have to be done in a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden you've realized that every single one of the chairs that you've decided to produce requires an unbelievable amount of work to get done. And it becomes about starting to really think about the styles that you're choosing and the decisions that you're making when you're starting to create your artistic style. So this is always what I talk about when I talk about like pre-production. This has become one of the biggest things in my like technical art, which is planning ahead and planning out what you are trying to accomplish and doing experiments to find out what can be done and what things look like before you launch in and just expect, okay, it's a hugely unrealistic concept to sit there and say, I'm just going to make this look amazing. It's such a broad concept that has no specifics associated with it. And one of the things that becomes really advantageous about starting to think about the real specifics in terms of style and tone that you want to capture is that you can begin to crunch down and very specifically pass out the particular components and elements that you want to try and create. So you're like, well, what are the color palettes that I need to use? What are the structures that I need to do? And this will end up becoming a really important component when you if you start doing art as a job, where people come to you and say, well, we need a room that does this, or we need objects that do this. You have to start thinking about, well, how can I make sure that the things that I'm creating are supporting the environment that they need without creating budgets that are going to, blow open? You only have so much time, you only have so much budget to do it. And you really need to really think strongly about what you're doing and how you're trying to do it. In Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which was the latest project that was finished by Tin Man, I had to sculpt and be involved in sculpting over 120 separate characters for the games and enemies, not to mention all of the player-related characters. And so what we did is we decided to take a really strong look at what the tone of the game was and what the concept was. So what we did is we said, well, we're trying to bring this old 80s adventure book story as though it were a tabletop game. So we said, well, let's make them miniatures so that rather than animating, rather than posing, it's as though you actually had a miniature and it was on a table. And then we started focusing all of our strengths into that sort of elements, thinking, well, how can we make this affordable? How can we make it look good? How can we do it for a team that is essentially small, very small, especially because aside from using some outside contractors, I was the main artist on that project. And so we used techniques such as scanning real, actual miniature characters on a flatbed scanner so that it would look authentic and also be affordable for us to be able to get those components in, as well as being able to carve our own miniatures to try and match those styles and using the similar procedures as they used. So for instance, instead of thinking about using high quality and high res textures, we literally put our miniatures into ZBrush and painting programs and used the same techniques that you use in real life to paint miniatures to paint our digital miniatures. Whoopsie daisies. And this is where we really begin to think about things like pipeline. Think about when you're trying to do art for other clients, trying to do arts for yourselves or on your own projects, you think about, how am I going to do it? What does it actually look like when I'm doing it? What is the outcome? What is the final product that needs to be delivered? What are all the steps that I need to get there? And how am I going to be able to do that efficiently without suddenly finding myself spending 2.5 weeks on just unwrapping objects or what have you? Because really one of the most important parts about game art is being able to iterate. Being able to go back again and fix and change and clean. One of the interesting things is, even as Brooke was mentioning in the previous one, is you can find the objectives of the game or the mechanics or even certain aspects of the story begin to shift over time. And you need to be able to update and adapt your objects for being able to account for these changes. And art and style is actually a lot of components that all work together to create the final product. We're talking about things as varied from models to texturing to lighting to shaders to color. Any one of these concepts can become a sudden black hole without you even realizing that it's going to happen, when all of a sudden you can find yourself being bottlenecked by any one of these concepts. If you find that your team doesn't have anybody who knows how to do intensive shader work, you might find that there are certain effects and certain elements that you're just not going to be able to do efficiently. So you really need to be aware of these things before you step in there. This is one of the things that I always like to talk about, because I've heard quite a few people talk about when they're trying to make their own games, being like, well, I'll just buy some asset packs and I'll just fill it with some of the art, and that stuff looks great. Be super careful. It can be a trap, a really deep trap. So I actually do use asset packs myself, and I don't necessarily talk about not using them, but you need to go in with your eyes open. They aren't a catch-all solution to everything. Nothing is truly cheap. You always have to pay for it somehow. And one of the things about asset packs is that they can very quickly become difficult to use if you find that they either used a workflow or they used a style that you're not comfortable or you're not familiar with. I have worked on projects previously where I have been called in and I need to replicate an art style that they've been working in because they've started with this asset pack, and I've taken one look at them and their props and I'm like, well, this is going to cost a couple $100s to do. And they're like, what? I just need these objects. And I'm like, yeah, it takes hours to be able to paint hand-detailed textures for every single prop and object. And you found them for $150. That's amazing. Well done. But the reason why they're cheap is because they're being sold to a lot of people on bulk. And so this can be really dangerous. Although, if you're an artist, it can be a great opportunity to buy other people's artworks and really study the way that they're created and what makes them look good. So they really do have a good basis that you can use, but be really careful. You can sink because of them. Here's another one. You really need to value your time. Sometimes there have been opportunities where I've been like, oh, this is a couple $100. I'm not sure if I can justify it. You can justify it. You will find yourself spending hours and hours and hours on sometimes just silly tasks. And you'll think, well, that didn't cost any money. Well, it did. There was an opportunity cost because you spent a lot of time doing something that was unnecessary or something that took a lot of time. So really start thinking about the tools that you're using and the ways that you're using them, because this will become a really important component. And furthermore, if you're a programmer or you're a designer, get a basic understanding of the tools that the artists are using, because sometimes you're going to find yourself with unavailable to artists. And I assure you, I've never met a programmer and I've never met a designer that didn't have to open up Photoshop once in order to quickly fix something or type something in or take a look at something. You will eventually have to do it. So just spend a little bit of time understanding how these other people are working. And this is always a thing I talk about, which is, especially if you're an artist and you're looking at getting kind of involved in the industry, really start thinking about what skills that you can bring to it. I've become very much towards technical art because I definitely noticed that there was a lack of proficiency in that area, especially from artists who knew how to shader code, who knew how to do all of these things. So this is the area that I ended up specifying in. But there's a lot of areas that are really, really in need of specific talents, things like animation programmers, where it's actually an incredibly arduous and difficult concept dealing with animations, and there aren't enough programmers who understand these concepts. And I think I'm just running out of time. So I always think really interesting, look at other games and think about the decisions they made in terms of style and art and what advantages they got out of that and why they probably chose those particular ones, because you're really going to have to be thinking about every decision you're making. And don't think about this. This is really dangerous. You can find yourself 12 miles deep in a project. If you don't know what amazing looks like before you start, and you spend the time downloading and researching and creating yourself reference libraries of images and ideas, especially if you're an artist, but also designer and everybody else, you're going to find yourself trapped trying to figure out how to make something look good. And again, the very final thing for artists as well is when you're creating portfolios, this is something that I don't think gets mentioned enough, but try and focus upon creating things that people recognize and can understand what they are. You can create me a really cool looking sword gun crossbow, but I'm not going to know whether or not the decisions that you made were deliberate or whether or not some of them were accidental and looked amazing. And so it becomes really important to make sure that in your portfolios and in what you're showing, I need to see a real deliberate, focused concentration on what the outcome was. And if at all possible, try and use some concept art as your guiding line. Because in my career, I've had to do things from modeling objects from even the most vague images to literally sculpting a person's face from a photo, and you have to be confident in your ability to replicate real life digitally. And that's probably, the best things that I can convey.
Thank you very much.